The conflict is evolving into a prolonged contest of endurance. The war's center of gravity shifted decisively from territorial conquest towards the struggle for sustainability and strategic resilience. That quote from the Lviv Herald just perfectly captures the stark reality on the ground right now. As this war enters its fifth summer campaigning season, that era of sweeping territorial gains and massive, rapid breakthroughs, well, that's completely behind us. What we're looking at today is a grueling test of endurance. Welcome to The Explainer. I'm incredibly glad you're here because understanding this fundamental shift is absolutely crucial for anyone trying to make sense of modern global security. Today, we're unpacking exactly how this conflict has entirely transformed.
Okay, let's dive into this. To truly grasp what's happening in Ukraine as of summer 2026, we have to recognize that there isn't just one single war going on anymore. We're actually looking at a conflict playing out across two entirely distinct yet deeply connected battlefields. The first is that physical, kinetic military struggle that we see on the news every single day. But the second? That's a massive, looming macroeconomic challenge that will honestly dictate the future of the region long after the guns actually fall silent.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the battlefield in 2026. 2, the war of logistics. 3, calculating the damage. 4, funding the reconstruction. And finally, number 5, the EU budget shortfall. We're going to connect the dots all the way from the stalemated front lines right up to the complex European budgets of 2028 and beyond.
All right, let's start with part 1, the battlefield in 2026. The physical realities of this war have shifted so dramatically over the past few years, it's honestly staggering. The strategies of 2024 or 2025, they simply do not apply today. If we contrast the traditional massed assaults of the early war with what analysts are now calling the attritional maneuver of 2026, the difference is literally night and day. And why is that? Because the battlefield has become completely transparent, meaning everyone sees everything almost instantly. Thanks to FPV drones, autonomous strike systems, and these highly advanced reconnaissance platforms, it's become nearly impossible for either side to mass troops or armor without immediate detection and targeting. The Lviv Herald noted that this technological evolution has made vast areas of the front extraordinarily vulnerable. So while Russia retains its manpower advantages, and Ukraine continues to absorb attacks and launch counterstrikes, like what we've seen in the fiercely contested Pokrovsk and Sumy sectors, this total drone dominance means traditional breakthroughs are incredibly rare. It's basically a strategic stalemate paired with intense tactical dynamism.
Moving on to part 2, the war of logistics. Now, what's really interesting about this is how that frontline stalemate has completely changed the geography of the fighting. The most impactful fighting isn't just in the trenches anymore. It's happening hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. Ukraine has significantly escalated its long-range interdictions, directly targeting Russian sustainment capabilities. Based on reports from the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainian drones recently struck the Azad chemical plant in Tula, which produces explosive materials, and the Temp oil depot in Riskbank, which is this massive strategic reserve facility holding over 60 storage tanks. Keep in mind, these targets are hundreds of kilometers deep into Russian territory. It perfectly highlights the incredible scale and reach of modern drone warfare. But it's not just drones. International pressure is really mounting on Russian supply lines. British forces recently intercepted a Russian Shadow Fleet oil tanker, the Smerthus, right in the English Channel, the first interception of its kind. And in a massive strategic shift, the Russian military command is reportedly relocating its remaining Black Sea Fleet command structures, all of occupied Sevastopol in Crimea, all the way over to Novorossiysk. Why? Simply because severe logistics issues and Ukrainian strikes are making Crimea completely untenable for their headquarters. The real battle right now is all about choking those supply lines.
Which brings us to part 3, calculating the damage.
We're going to execute a hard pivot here, from military strategy to the raw physical toll this has taken. What does this transparent, highly destructive drone and missile warfare actually leave in its wake? $195.1 billion. Just let that sink in for a second. To put that massive number into perspective, that is roughly the entire annual GDP of a country like New Zealand, just wiped out, and that's physical damage alone. According to the Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment compiled by the World Bank, the UN, the EU, and the Ukrainian government, this is the estimated direct damage to Ukraine by the end of 2025. It's a harsh transition to the economic reality of a nation that has endured years of relentless bombardment.
But replacing what was lost isn't the whole story. So the crucial point is that the principle driving this recovery is Build Back Better, or BBB. You see, when we talk about recovery, Ukraine cannot and shouldn't simply rebuild a 1970s-era power grid or uninsulated apartment blocks. Think about your own city's infrastructure. You wouldn't rebuild a destroyed smart grid with analog, outdated technology, right? Reconstructing these facilities means meeting modern, much higher standards for living conditions, energy efficiency, the green transition, and, perhaps most importantly, security. We're talking about building hardened protections against future airstrikes. Now, obviously, this standard significantly raises the cost of recovery, but it is absolutely vital for the nation's long-term survival.
When we visualize these needs sector by sector, the sheer scale of the crisis becomes incredibly clear. The top 3 sector recovery needs are just astronomical. The energy sector alone requires an estimated $96.1 billion, a number that was exacerbated heavily by those devastating airstrikes during the winter of 2025 and 2026. Then we have housing coming in at $89.8 billion. And we really can't forget the human element here. This reflects the massive crisis of internally displaced persons, families, and returning refugees who desperately need secure, modern shelter. Transport infrastructure will require nearly $72 billion. When you add it all up across all the sectors, the estimated recovery need for the next 10 years sits at a staggering $457 billion.
That leads us right into Part 4, funding the reconstruction.
So, how exactly do you finance a 10-year recovery process that needs over $450 billion? Well, we have to break down where this money actually needs to come from. Purely public funding, so money from foreign governments and international bodies, is estimated at around $92.8 billion, and that's focused heavily on social protection and basic public goods. Then, completely private funding is expected to cover about $106.5 billion, targeting commerce, industry, and agriculture. But look at that massive chunk in the middle. $257.7 billion requires mixed funding. Critical sectors like energy and transport will rely heavily on a 50-50 split of mixed public and private investments. Getting this done practically relies on targeted guarantee schemes and geopolitical risk insurance. Essentially, they have to convince private companies that it's actually safe to invest in a post-war environment.
And finally, Part 5, the EU budget shortfall.
Because while we know exactly what the reconstruction requires, actually securing the public portion of that funding is proving to be a monumental challenge. Enter the European Parliament's proposed multi-annual financial framework, or MFF, for the years 2028 to 2034. And this brilliantly illustrates the scope of the challenge. As the primary geopolitical backer for Ukraine moving forward, the EU's budget planning is basically the institutional bedrock for post-war aid. The Parliament's budgetary support unit has modeled exactly what will be required.
But there is a massive gap in these models. When calculating the 10-year public funding need, and this is based on the assumption that aid reaches only government-controlled territories and relies heavily on that private investment we talked about, the absolute lowest required public funding estimate is €196.5 billion. However, the draft legislation for the EU's Ukraine Reserve in the 2028-2034 MFF proposes an allocation of just €88.9 billion in 2025 prices. As the briefing plainly states, this proposed allocation is entirely insufficient, and why this matters is stark. We aren't just talking about a rounding error here. It's a massive financial chasm that threatens the entire recovery strategy.
Let's see how this builds and compounds, because this shortfall doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is part of a very complex macroeconomic web. The European Parliament's report outlines several severe hurdles making this funding gap incredibly difficult to bridge. First, the models must account for reductions in U.S. aid under the second Trump administration, meaning the EU must shoulder a significantly heavier burden. Second, current geopolitical realities make the payment of Russian war reparations highly unlikely. Third, official aid can't simply be handed out as loans anymore because Ukraine's sovereign debt already exceeds 100% of its GDP. They absolutely need grants, not more debt. And finally, there's a physical limit to rebuilding. Historical data shows that a post-conflict economy's absorption capacity is limited to about 20% of its GDP. Even if you handed Ukraine $1 trillion tomorrow, the economy and labor force physically could not absorb and spend that money effectively all at once. It has to be a slow, steady, multi-year pipeline.
Which leaves us with this final, truly vital question. As the center of gravity on the battlefield shifts decisively away from territorial conquest and transforms into a grueling test of endurance, will long-term financial resilience ultimately decide the outcome of the conflict? We've seen how kinetic warfare has ground to an attritional halt through drone dominance, and we've seen the staggering multi-billion-dollar bureaucratic and financial mountains that have to be climbed to sustain and rebuild the nation. The physical war and the economic war are now one and the same. The ultimate victor might not just be the one who holds the most territory, but the one whose balance sheet can actually survive the decade. How long can the endurance hold? It's something we'll all be watching closely. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time on The Explainer.